I never imagined that grief could have layers, but the day after my son's funeral, I learned there was something even sharper than burying your own child. It was the sting of betrayal being told by the woman he married that I no longer belonged in the very house I had helped build. My son's laughter had filled these walls. My hands had chosen the paint, planted the garden, and paid off the mortgage when times were hard. Yet standing there with swollen eyes and a heart split in half, I was treated like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. Ashley, my daughter-in-law, didn't even bother softening the words. She was polished as always, with that steady voice she used when she wanted to make cruelty sound like practicality. She said the house was too big, that it made more sense for her and the kids to have the space, and that I should think about downsizing. Downsizing, what a neat word to cover up what it really was being cast out. The ground hadn't even settled over my son's grave, and already she was rearranging a life that no longer included me. I remember staring at her, my mind refusing to register the audacity, and then, almost as if rehearsed, she mentioned the lawyer, a man who spoke in calm, clipped tones, reminding me of documents and signatures, as if paperwork could erase decades of sweat, love, and sacrifice. He didn't mean harm, but neutrality can feel as cruel as malice when your world is collapsing. He represented facts. She represented greed. And I represented nothing more to them than an obstacle. The worst part wasn't the words themselves, but the timing. Grief has a way of making you fragile, like glass one breath away from shattering. She chose that moment deliberately, when she thought I would be too broken to resist. Maybe she believed I'd simply fold into myself and slip away quietly, taking my memories with me. But betrayal has a strange effect. It cracked something open inside me. I wasn't just mourning anymore, I was awakening. And what Ashley never expected was that buried beneath my sorrow was a steel spine. She thought she had cornered me, but she had no idea of the truths still waiting to surface. My son had left more behind than she realized, and soon she would learn that grief can turn into resolve. Because while she was busy writing me off, I was beginning to remember the life I had lived before this loss, the sacrifices, the love, the warnings I ignored. And those memories were about to guide me into the fight of my life. When I look back now, before everything crumbled, I see the years with my son painted in warm colors. I remember the little apartment where it was just the two of us after his father passed. The nights when I stayed up sewing patches on his jeans because buying new ones wasn't in the budget. The mornings when I packed his lunch with whatever I could stretch, slipping in a note just to remind him he was loved. I carried the weight of two parents on my shoulders, but I never once saw it as a burden. Every sacrifice felt like an investment in his future, and the sound of his laughter in those narrow hallways made every long hour worth it. I watched him grow into a man I was proud of, hardworking, kind, determined. I used to imagine the life he would build, a home filled with warmth, a family that would cherish him. For a while, I let myself believe that vision was becoming real. When he brought Ashley into our lives, I tried to open my heart to her. She was polished, confident, the kind of woman who always seemed to be performing for an audience. At first, I brushed off the small remarks she made, the way she wrinkled her nose at the meals I cooked, or how she once said my furniture looked quaint in a tone that felt more like pity than admiration. Back then, I convinced myself it was nerves, or maybe just her way of adjusting to new family dynamics. But hindsight has a way of sharpening those memories. What I once dismissed as little slips of the tongue, I now recognize as cracks in the foundation, a certain distance in her smile, a careful avoidance of real connection. My son never saw it. He believed she respected me, that we were building something together. And I wanted to believe it too. Those were the years that carried me through the warmth of raising him, the hope that love and sacrifice would return as respect. But standing at his funeral, I would learn that those golden days had vanished, leaving me to face the cold truth of how far I had been pushed to the edges of his new life. The morning of the funeral felt heavier than any day I had lived before. The sky itself seemed to sag with sorrow, gray clouds hanging low as if the world had decided to mourn alongside me. I moved through the service in a haze, clutching tissues that were never enough to catch the endless stream of tears. Every hymn, every kind word spoken, cut deeper into the wound that losing my son had left. I kept waiting to wake up, to hear his voice again, to see him walk through those church doors with that tired smile that always lit up my heart. But reality was relentless. My son was gone, and the weight of that truth pressed on my chest like a stone. I looked at Ashley, dressed in flawless black, her makeup untouched by tears. She dabbed at her eyes occasionally, as if she remembered she was supposed to. But her shoulders were straight, her jaw steady, and her gaze flickered more often toward the guests than toward the casket. It was as if she were performing grief rather than drowning in it. I noticed that flicker of relief in her eyes, subtle but undeniable, like someone who had been waiting for the next chapter to begin. In that moment, I told myself I was imagining things, but the unease settled in my stomach like lead. After the burial, family and neighbors gathered back at the house. The very walls seemed to ache with silence, stripped of my son's voice. I had barely set my coat down when Ashley approached me. Her tone was measured, too composed for someone who had just buried her husband. She told me it was time for me to think about moving out, that the house was now hers to manage, and that it wasn't practical for me to stay. The words pierced through the fog of grief like knives. I could hardly process them. One day, after laying my child to rest, I was being cast aside like clutter no longer useful. I felt my body go cold. Grief and anger collided in my chest until I could hardly breathe. I wanted to scream, to ask her if she had any idea what this house meant, how many nights I had stayed awake in these rooms praying for my boy's future. But the words wouldn't come. I simply stood there, crushed by the cruelty of it all, realizing I was more alone than ever. And yet, deep within that silence, a small spark flickered. Ashley thought she was sweeping me out of the picture. What she didn't know was that my son had left behind something more permanent than her schemes. Something that would change everything. The day of the will reading arrived sooner than I was ready for. I sat in the lawyer's office with my hands clasped tightly in my lap, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain everyone could hear it. The air smelled of polished wood and old paper, but beneath that quiet orderliness, my world still felt like chaos. I didn't know what to expect, only that I dreaded another blow I might not survive. Ashley, on the other hand, looked as if she were walking into a celebration rather than a legal proceeding. She sat straight-backed in her chair, her eyes shining with the certainty of someone convinced that her life was about to become easier. Her fingers tapped against her designer handbag with restless anticipation. She had already moved me out of the picture in her mind, already decided this house, this money, this future belonged to her alone. The lawyer, Mr. Harlan, began with the formalities, his voice steady and neutral, his expression betraying nothing. My stomach twisted as he read through the first few lines. My son's name sounded so heavy, spoken aloud in that quiet office, as if even paper could not bear the weight of his absence. For a moment, I closed my eyes and wished he were still here, that this was all a mistake. Ashley leaned forward, lips curved into the faintest of smiles, waiting for the moment she had already rehearsed in her head, the moment she would be declared sole heir. I braced myself, afraid of the humiliation that might follow, the cruel victory I would be forced to watch. And then came the words that changed everything. My son had named me, his mother, as the primary beneficiary. The house, the accounts, everything he had worked for, he'd left it in my hands. The room seemed to tilt. Relief washed over me so suddenly I could hardly breathe. Ashley's smile faltered, her composure cracking just enough for me to see the fury simmering beneath. She masked it quickly, but the truth was out. Her confidence had been built on assumptions, and those assumptions had just collapsed. In that moment, I realized something I had forgotten in my grief. I was not powerless. My son had trusted me, chosen me, and ensured I would not be left to the mercy of others. For the first time since his passing, I felt a spark of strength returning. Ashley sat rigid beside me, stunned and seething. She thought she had secured her victory, but she was wrong. The balance of power had shifted, and deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. When the details of the inheritance were laid out in front of me, it was as if I could finally breathe again. My son had thought carefully, not just about his wife and children, but about me, his mother, the woman who had stood beside him through every storm. The deed to the house carried my name. The savings account was listed under my authority, and even a separate trust had been created to ensure I would never be left with nothing. It wasn't about the money. It was about the message he saw me. He valued me, and he wanted me protected. For the first time since his passing, I felt my grief soften under the weight of something else: pride, gratitude, even a quiet sense of justice. My son had remembered who carried him when no one else did. That knowledge gave me strength I hadn't known I still had. Ashley, of course, didn't take it quietly. She tried to spin the situation, leaning on half-hearted smiles and condescending tones, suggesting that it must have been a clerical error, that perhaps I was only meant to hold the property until she and the children were ready. Every word dripped with entitlement. She acted as if my years of sacrifice had been nothing more than background noise, and she expected me to continue fading into silence. But something inside me had shifted. I wasn't the frail, grieving woman she thought I was. I sat there, listening, watching her try to minimize what my son had chosen, and I knew I would not hand back the gift of respect he had left me. Her words no longer had the power to cut. They only revealed her desperation. In that moment, I made a promise to myself. I had been silent for too long, shrinking to keep the peace, letting myself become invisible in my own family. That time was over. This inheritance was more than property. It was a reminder of my worth, a spark that lit something fierce in my chest. Ashley believed she had won when she pushed me toward the door of my own home. But she was wrong. What she didn't realize was that I was done playing the quiet role she had assigned me. I had power now, and I intended to use it. And soon enough, she would learn what it meant to underestimate me. Once the shock of the will reading faded, I knew I had a choice to make. I could shrink back into grief and let Ashley continue to dictate the terms of my life, or I could take the gift my son had left me and finally reclaim control. For too long, I had allowed others to speak over me, to make me small. That part of me was gone. What replaced it was quiet resolve. The first step was paperwork. I met with Mr. Harlan again. This time, not as a timid widow, but as the rightful owner of the assets my son had entrusted to me. We went over deeds, accounts, and trust documents until everything was clear. By the time I left his office, I held not only proof of ownership, but also a plan. The house Ashley believed was hers to rule over would soon have a for sale sign in the yard. I wasn't doing it out of spite. I was doing it because I refused to live under a roof where I had been treated as an inconvenience. Placing that sign on the lawn was a moment I'll never forget. I stood at the window as the realtor hammered it into the earth, each strike of the post echoing like a drumbeat of justice. For years, I had felt invisible in that home. But now, with 3 bold letters "Sold" looming over the yard, I was no longer the one being cast aside. Ashley's panic came swiftly. Her calls filled my phone, each one more frantic than the last. She demanded explanations, tried to guilt me with pleas about the children, then shifted to threats about legal action. I listened in silence, letting her words wash over me like static. She was finally the one losing sleep, pacing the floors, realizing that the security she had counted on was never hers to begin with. But here is where the story turned from revenge into something deeper. With every document signed, every account secured, I began to feel lighter. My grief hadn't vanished, but it no longer anchored me. I was no longer surviving. Day by day, I was building something new. I started making lists, not of debts or chores, but of dreams. Places I wanted to visit, books I wanted to read, skills I had put off learning because life had always demanded too much of me. The real twist wasn't that Ashley lost control. It was that I found mine. For the first time in decades, I could ask myself what I wanted without anyone else's shadow looming over the answer. I wasn't simply punishing her, I was choosing myself. That, I realized, was the sweetest form of justice. Of course, Ashley didn't stop pushing back. Her desperation grew as the sale of the house moved forward, as accounts she thought she could depend on were no longer within reach. The more frantic she became, the calmer I felt. I wasn't afraid of her anymore. I knew the law was on my side, and even more importantly, I knew I was strong enough to face her. And so I waited, knowing that the confrontation was inevitable. She would come to me eventually, cornered by her own arrogance, ready to unleash every last ounce of her fury. But I was ready to look her in the eye, steady and unshaken, and show her just how wrong she had been to underestimate me. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. Ashley showed up at my door unannounced, her composure already unraveling. Her polished exterior was gone, her makeup streaked, her voice unsteady. She paced the living room like a caged animal, her words spilling out in a tangled mix of pleas and accusations. She begged me to reconsider, proclaimed I was tearing apart what little family remained, then turned sharp and venomous, warning me that I would regret this decision. I listened in silence. I didn't raise my voice, didn't match her fury. Instead, I stood calm and still, watching her unravel, the weight of her own choices finally pressing down. I could almost see the realization dawning in her eyes that she was no longer in control, that her schemes had failed. There was a time when her words would have cut me, when I would have scrambled to explain myself or tried to keep the peace for the sake of family harmony. But that woman no longer existed. I had walked through fire, and grief had burned away every illusion that silence would keep me safe. When she finally stopped, her chest heaving, I spoke. I told her that my son had made his choice long before this day. He had trusted me with his life and his legacy, and that was not something she could erase with manipulation or cruelty. I reminded her that this house, this security, was not hers to claim. It was the result of sacrifices she never bothered to see. Her eyes widened, and for a moment I thought she might collapse under the weight of it. She tried one last tactic, her voice trembling as she painted herself the victim, as if I were the one stealing from her. But the truth was clear. I didn't have to shout it, didn't have to fight. All I had to do was stand firm. I told her, quietly but firmly, that I would no longer be diminished. I would no longer shrink to fit her expectations. My dignity was not hers to bargain with, and my life was not hers to control. For the first time, I felt the strength of those words settle deep into my bones. Ashley left that day with fury in her eyes, but it was laced with fear, the fear of someone who finally understood she had lost. I closed the door behind her and stood in the silence, feeling a peace I hadn't known in years. The war was over, and I had won not through anger, but through resolve. And in that quiet, I began to realize something even greater. This wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one I had been too afraid to claim until now. When I look back now, I see that this journey was never really about revenge. It was about finding my voice again after years of silence. Losing my son nearly broke me, but what came after forced me to remember who I was before grief and dismissal tried to strip me of my worth. The true victory wasn't in watching Ashley lose, it was in choosing myself, in reclaiming the dignity that should never have been questioned in the first place. I learned that resilience isn't loud or dramatic, it's steady. A quiet insistence on standing tall when others expect you to bow. Revenge can feel satisfying in the moment, but what lasts is self-respect, boundaries, and the peace that comes when you stop apologizing for existing. If you've ever been underestimated or made to feel small, I hope my story reminds you of your strength. Share your own journey in the comments. I'd love to hear your voice.